Hello, everybody. Grant Hunter here with another Product Conversations. Steve, a couple months ago, and I need to do it more frequently, I was having lunch with Scott Sehlhorst, and he told me he was working on writing a book on problem statements. And I said, oh my God, we have to have that conversation on Product Conversations. And so obviously he's here. We're doing that. He actually suggested adding Kent McDonald, but I want to take you back. 20 some years ago at some other training company, market problems became this big thing and documenting market problems. But today I still see this as a problem companies have, is properly doing it. Talk to me about the last century of problems. I'm joking.
Well, it's been a long time. We had this problem way back in the day when we were writing like product requirements documents. We would always scooch into the product shall have a button on this screen that does this thing, as opposed to the product shall address this problem. So we've kind of always had that. But it was kind of interesting. One of the companies you were mentioning used to talk a lot about market research as opposed to market problems. And what happened was everybody would say, oh yeah, we have a department for that. And it's like, well, yeah, that's the execution of, but who's deciding what things it is that we are researching, And so talking about it in the context of finding friction or finding problems to solve has always been a very healthy way, I think, of getting people to kind of reorient around the what and the how and not the how.
Awesome. And we've put together an amazing panel, I think, for this conversation of problem statements, along with Steve, obviously May Wong, regular here, one of our regulars, Pamela Schure. And I'm going to go out and say two experts on problem statements just purely because they've written some great stuff on problem statements. And if you look in the comments, there's been multiple, I think, posts shared from both Kent and Scott Sehlhorst. So Scott Sehlhorst and Kent McDonald, both on their first and hopefully not last product conversations that we're having here. I'm going to start this with Scott, since you were my inspiration. You're my muse when it comes to problem statements. How do you write an impactful problem statement?
Okay, well, first of all, hey everybody, and thanks for bringing me in, and thanks to everybody who's here. I'll give you a warning if you go too far into problem statements. You can see what's happened to Kent and I, so tread lightly. In terms of impactful problem statements, I'm going to frame it up the way I frame it up, which might not be where everybody's coming from. But I start by thinking about the job of the problem statement. So it's not just how do I craft a problem statement that sends the team in the direction of creating something impactful for the customer. Like, we got to do that. But I'm looking a little bit more broadly. And what I've distilled it into is three main problems that we have to solve, that problem statements are useful to help us solve. One is improve our product thinking. So like Steve talked about, hey, somebody else did the research. Well, I got to do some synthesis. I've got to set some direction. I've got to have some ideas like that forming and tightening up of your product thinking. Creating the problem statement is the act of creating that artifact improves your thinking. So straight up, just like get better at setting a direction. Mm-hmm. And then the second thing is sort of living outside of that problem statement. It's not just let me double click inside it and get some nice, tight, coherent understanding of what I'm going to try and go do, but take a step up and think about, what am I trying to do with my product strategy? There's a bunch of problems that we're going to try and solve, and we can operationally encapsulate them in epics and problem statements and say, it's this one and this one, but not those three. And so you need some sort of language that allows you to make comparisons that says, these ones are better than those ones. And it's a lot of this and it's a little bit of that. Like, so we need some sort of dialogue and some tool to help us shape a product strategy to manifest what we're trying to do. And then that third piece is, okay, what we're trying to do, let's execute on that. Let's get some clarity of purpose into the hands of the team so that it's not this train wreck of a dictatorial task rabbit of go build the stuff I told you to build because I told you to build it, which is awful for the developers, from a systems thinking point of view, gets in the way of interrogating the bad ideas, because some of our ideas are bad. We have no mechanism, no space for feedback and learning. Like it fundamentally breaks down in the system. So improve your product thinking, shape a better product in aggregate, and provide clarity of purpose to your team so you can execute. I think all of the stuff that we'll unpack and all of the stuff I'm unpacking in the book about how to do it and why to do it really bubbles up into those three things.
That's great. First question I thought about when you were talking about that is there a hierarchy of problem statements? When you talk strategy, I feel like, we talk about breaking stories down, right? Is there a problem statement that is I'll use initiative or theme level problem statement, and then one that's an epic level problem statement, and then one that's a user story level problem statement?
Can I say yes and no? Because I think May's right on the yes side of things, right? Problems are problems. We set directions. We're trying to accomplish stuff, and statements are statements, right? So yes, we're setting a purposeful direction with our company strategy, with our product strategy. We are also at that user story level, at that task level, we're trying to meaningfully do things that create value for our customers, that help them achieve their goals, that meet their expectations. And a well-written user story, and maybe we'll have another conversation where I'll get salty about the mess that almost everybody labels as user stories, are statements of problems we're trying to solve. But I actually think holding the space and at that higher level, OKRs become interesting value proposition canvases. There's different tools, and what I'm leaning into is draw a line in the sand and say, let's take a particular tool and apply it to a particular problem in the space. Mm-hmm. I lean into the problem statement at that quarterly planning epic sort of level. I'm trying to solve problems that are big enough to be meaningful and small enough to be actionable. It's both the direction setting stuff and the operationalizing. I'm really seeing those meet inside an organization and focusing on the problem statement to do that job.
I love that. That's great. And actually, I like you getting salty. You're getting me ready for margaritas later today before I go to the Billy Joel concert. So I'll have plenty of salt. Kent, you and Scott, have dueling articles on problem statements, referencing each other, but, sometimes diverging a little. I'd love to ask you that same question. Impactful. How do you write impactful problem statements?
Well, the way I came about even talking about problem statements in the first place was I was looking for a way to facilitate a conversation with a group of people about what they were actually working on. And the first time I used it, I was working with a team that had been working on something already for a couple of months. And I didn't have the inclination going in that there was as much misunderstanding about what they were all working on as there was. But so I found this template for a problem statement from a requirements handbook from Ellen Gottesdiener back in the day. And I said, okay, I'll just kind of do a workshop here with some Post-it notes and a whiteboard. So I had everybody go in and kind of fill out the 4 parts of a problem statement individually, and then had each one of them write it out. And they were all working on, it was maybe 10 people in there, and we ended up with 10 completely different perspectives on what it was they were working on. And so from that experience, I realized that problem statements are a great way to get everyone, quote unquote, on the same page, or at the very least, help them to find out that they're not on the same page. So I've actually used it just as much for stuff that was underway as getting started at the beginning, because it's usually the best. Because what happens is you all get started on an effort and everybody says, yep, we've locked hands. We're all in agreement. This is what we're trying to accomplish. They go on their merry ways. They're all making daily decisions. And then you get in there a little bit and you stop and say, okay, let's actually revisit what we're doing. And lo and behold, everybody was building something completely different, even though they were calling it the same thing.
It's amazing how often that happens. I mean, we see research about managers not even, senior leadership not even being aligned. And I think, when we did our corporate culture toxic impact, whatever that was, we had Vicki Reddington on, and she was talking about just how being 1 degree off or 2 degrees off at the senior leadership level, once you get down to the frontline people, it could be, depending on how big the organization, it can be huge. And I completely agree. Problem statements are a great place. What are you talked about the definition used? What were the 4 things? You said there was 4 things in the problem statement.
So it's one sticky note was the problem of. The second one is effects. So who does it affect? The third one is the impact of which is. And then the fourth one would be, and this is the tricky one because everyone's going to want to just write a solution. It's what are some characteristics of a successful solution? So kind of what are your constraints about what does it have to have? What has to be true in order for that solution to work? And then everyone filled out their own version separately and then read it together. And it's amazing the results you get from that and how widely dispersed they are. And then the secret is you actually have the group go through and coalesce around a single problem statement.
Yeah. A good way to get alignment and consensus of where we're going with it. And this is me learning as we do it. I've always had those first 3 or a version of, who has the problem, which is who does it affect? What is the problem they're facing and why would they want to change, which, goes to those first 3. But I love that addition of the, characteristics of what a proper solution would look like, and the constraints and then that type of stuff. I love it.
I have a story here.
Where's my raise my hand button?
There is not one on here. Let's go. Steve's story. Scott, raise your hand after that.
I did a rant after the last time we had snow here about, what problem are you trying to solve? And as an industry, we articulate it in the form of features. Don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. And I envision that 100 years ago, somebody said, I want to shovel the snow. I need a big shovel. And yet what we really need is a plow. You need to push the snow, not lift it. And for those of you from Texas, snow is like rain that falls, but it's frozen.
And I was going to say, Steve, if you're from like Canada, a plow can't handle 2 feet of what like affects snow. So it depends on.
Good point. And really that is the point. It's like, well, wait, what is you're really trying to solve for? And the answer is, I want to get my car out of the driveway. It's not that I want my driveway to have no snow in it, right? It's so to Kent's point, it's like, all right, let's really get down to what problem are we really solving? Because even shoveling the snow out of my driveway is, half solution and half the wrong problem.
Yeah, I love it. Scott, you were raising your hand.
Oh yeah, so the last piece of what Ken described is probably the only place that we diverge at all around problem statements, and I think it's in which part of the organizational problem or the systems problem are you trying to solve with it? And describing the characteristics of the solution, it makes a lot of sense to me, and it resonated with me as a former engineer, but I broke myself out of that space. Just, I don't know, the nature of what I ended up doing in my work for a while. But that, when I was doing some digging, the root cause for that went back into like Leffingwell's work and some of the stuff around systems architecture and sort of how do we use the problem statement to guide the development of the solution, right? And so that solutioning problem space, it's a necessary problem to solve. And that's where that approach to that fourth piece, right, describing the characteristics of the solution, provides some constraints and some guidance, and it gives you a way to evaluate what you're building. I go the other direction with it, and we need to be able to go both directions. So this is why we end up not agreeing to disagreeing, but I think both having valid points. I want to say that the benefits of the solution are X in order to inform the decisioning process around whether or not to solve it. I want to pull into that economic decision making of how much of the problem are we trying to solve? What do we think that's worth? We're placing a bet. How much should we be willing to spend? And
the value
which is
profile.
another problem we have to solve in addition to what are valid approaches. And so I twist that problem statement towards the decisioning side, not the solutioning side. But I think that's the only place that we play with it differently.
It's interesting because, you know, with when we do our problem statements, we actually have the what I'll call the scenario, which is really the who, what, why type portion of it. But then we've got some areas around constraints and needs, what must happen, what can't happen, what outcomes look like. And I think I love how bringing it all together. But those are things we like to do. Product management does the statement, the scenario, and the rest of the work is stuff that we do in collaboration with the pod or squad or team or whatever, quad as Steve is calling it lately, to bring it together. So there's probably some follow-up questions I want to have on that. I want to get to our other two panelists on that same question. And I'm going to start with Pamela. How do you write an impactful problem statement?
I find it very interesting, the fact that the diversion with Kent and Scott happens over how much do you stay with the problem, right? And so I'm going to kind of twist your question a little bit, which is, in working with groups, it's amazingly hard to keep them on a problem statement. It's phenomenally difficult. The amount of people that after a very short period of time say, okay, well, what are we going to do about it? It's like, we really don't understand what we're doing, right? And if we don't collectively understand and come to an agreement, how on earth are we going to be able to put something of value out there? And I think it's really, and as human beings, we are tied to this idea. If we do stuff, it'll be good, right? As opposed to, and by the way, I do sewing, right? And sewing, there's this statement, which is like, measure twice, cut once, right? And I think it's the same. Only with problem statements, there are sort of layers and layers of understanding what the problem is you're trying to solve. And going back, so for example, if you say the problem is, and who does it affect, right? If you think I've got a solution over here and I might be able to port it, that's fine. If you start changing who it affects, the solution, the whole problem breaks down, right? The whole problem definitely breaks down.
And you know, I wrote a post earlier in the week in support of this call where I was talking about, I was working with an ed tech, higher ed tech, and they said the professor was who it affected. And I'm like, okay, all professors or professors with tenure, or adjunct professors or TAs. And if you can't break it down to that level. And so I often, and this goes back to the question I asked Scott about earlier about the sort of the hierarchy or cascading of it. I'm like, at some level, you want to define the problem at the TAM, right? At the, you know, I called it the greatest common similarity. Right? There is a group of people who have a similar problem that's 80% the same, because that can give us an idea of, if we solve this problem, what could potentially a series of adjacencies be for us to grow our maybe to grow our SAM towards the TAM, right? And then, but then get down to the least common difference, right? Is this problem the same or different for these two people, right? If it's different, what's that minimum place we can get to?
Yeah. And I think that, you know, so I've seen some of Scott's work somewhere else, right? And it was just very interesting to look at it and to be able to really define who you're talking about in very great detail and what the problem is you're solving for them. Because when you do that, you can reorder your work. Otherwise, you're just scattershotting it. You could get done and have nothing of value, right?
Yeah.
So this work is hard. It's hard to get everybody on the same page. It really goes against everybody's grain. They are all trying to come up with a solution, and you have to stop them over and over and over again. And so in actually working through this is the biggest difficulty. How do you stop people from solutioning?
Yeah. And I see that all the time. It's one of the places we see with clients a lot is that they are solutioning. May, I've got so many follow-up questions I want to ask, but I want to sort of get everybody into the voice in there. Impactful problem statements.
Perhaps we should stop thinking about problem statements even just as an alignment tool and more of a marketing tool. And this is probably a really hot take, but I think that, yeah, we use it for alignment, but in terms of getting people to think about things the right way. But everyone comes with their own preconceived notions and ideas of what's going to be right. And in order to get people to really focus on this specific subset of problems with under the overarching strategy, say you've actually done the work and done the alignment on the strategy and done the alignment and division of responsibility, so everyone has clear roles and responsibilities. Yes, like that happens. But it's even if you do that, you still have to overcome that, um, in a way, that gut reaction to jump into that solutioning, and really to frames a problem in a way that helps people understand this is the context that we're focused on, here is the problem we're trying to solve, and also an invitation for people to give their input on what they do know, so we have more context, we can build out that larger space of what we understand, right? Because the problem statement, it's like in a way just a statement, but really it could also be an invitation for more, so that you could collectively come up with a better solution after you fleshed out all of those other concepts. But could it not be a way to attract people to, in a way, focus and have a conversation?
I'm gonna request StreamYard put a raise hand button in the chat.
Yep, I'd love to climb on May's hot take train.
Go ahead.
When I think about the purpose of any artifact, I think of there's 4 jobs. There is creation, collaboration, communication, and coordination. So creation and collaboration, right? Whether you do it by yourself or you do it in a group, right? Getting aligned on purpose, getting focused on what are the problem we're solving. Like, totally agree. Like that's part of it. The communication side, I think, is what you were is how I process what you're tapping into from the marketing. And that communication is up, down, and across, right? Up is coherence of, these are the bets you're placing. This is what you should expect to occur. Let's revisit our direction, like go into all of the Chris Argyris double loop learning of let's challenge the assumptions that are setting directions, have a healthy organization, that stuff. Communication down is that clarity of purpose stuff I was talking about. And then communication across is more effectively aligning your organization and getting into that sort of portfolio management type stuff. So I think it is all of those things. For sure. And you have to have those kinds of dialogues at the different strata, right? Like at your, the time span of discretion of sprint by sprint, story by story, team by team, but also at those 1 to 3 year, we're setting direction for the company. And then quarter by quarter, how are we making a difference? How are we competing? How are we showing up in the market? Like, we have to do all this stuff at all these places.
Exactly. And I was just having a conversation with the CEO of a client today. And the problem statement also is pure marketing, right? When we do a release, when we launch it, if we have good problem statements, it helps write the copy. It helps us communicate to the users, to the customers, to the buyers, what we're doing. So I love it. And in the chat, Michael Goyden talking about Drucker. Well, I took it to Drucker, but marketing is strategy, right? If you go back to the foundations of, knowing and understanding the customer so well, your product or service fits them and sells itself. Steve, I don't think I've been doing a good enough job getting Drucker quotes in here, so I may try to pack some in.
Here, you want one?
You're going to lose your position as Drucker Fellow if you don't quote him a little bit more.
There is surely nothing quite so useless as doing with great efficiency what should not be done at all. There's your Drucker quote.
I think I know who my challenger for my title is. I'm going to go to Kent with one of the follow-up questions I wanted to have. How important is it to have good segmentation and personas to do good problem statements?
How efficient do you want to be in building your product?
You're not Kent.
Oh, sorry. I missed the first part. My bad. Consider that part B of the question then.
What Scott said. No, I think it's extremely important. And what I have found is that in some cases, and again, because I primarily use problem statements as a way of sparking a conversation, often when we start in that exercise, there isn't a good understanding of personas and segmentation. And one of the things that the exercise of starting to talk through a problem statement does is reveal the need for much more finite personas and segmentation. So that's my thought there. I did want to circle back to something that Scott said and note that, and actually I found that my MO tends to be, I use a lot of very simple approaches to spark conversations for different purposes. So if I'm actually wanting to intentionally drive a decision on whether or not we should do something by understanding what the problem is, there's actually a separate set of questions I use to do that. And it's based off of a opportunity assessment that Kagan put in his first book that I've kind of twisted around a little bit for more internal products that goes into the, is it worth doing this type of thing? So totally agree that using the right tool for the right toolbox.
Awesome. Scott, want to add on any more or?
No, like that's, I think for the people who are, going to get some value walking away from this, I'm going to go write a problem statement or whatever, like they're not just enjoying the conversation as practitioners like us, but I want to do something. I think Kent's point can't be overemphasized, that this is a tool for reflecting the things you need to figure out. Like it's bringing together into a consumable chunk the consequences of a whole lot of work, and trying to pull it together is that glaring light that says you haven't done the work yet.
Yeah.
Right. Whether it's building a customer benefit analysis where you can do some economic model that says, if I fix monthly average users, it's going to result in what?
Yeah.
Or having some sort of a homogeneous understanding of people who share the same problems and value the solutions in the same way, like however you want to approach persona development.
It's interesting. One of my grad school professors, Stu Byther, actually had been a student of Drucker's, and his definition of market segments, sometimes may get into what we call personas, but he said, a market segment is a group of individuals who share a similar problem and react similar to the same value prop. The same value profile. And I think that that's a key thing, that if we understand those things, and so I'm going to pivot from the segment and persona to that second half of it, right? And you talked about with the customer benefit analysis. I'm going to start with Pamela. It's like, for a good problem statement, how much do you need to understand about value?
If you don't understand value, you're lost, right? And so I'll share a story, okay? So I once had a formula, right? And if you put in all the columns, then you could come up with an answer, right? And I ran it with someone, and we both agreed that it was the right thing to do, but it was the wrong thing to do. So in other words, our superficial understanding of what we were trying to do led to disaster. Okay. Mm-hmm. So your need on the persona side to both understand the personas and the market, and I think those are two different things. You can have multiple personas that affect a particular market, right? Yep. Is completely necessary. And when I work with teams, when we get to the persona question, it's almost always a stop. We almost always have to stop the work and go figure that out, because they just don't have that information. They are making huge assumptions. And I have to go, is this true? Is it not true? Right? So
and what would have to be true?
It has to, you have to have that information. It has to be reasonably accurate. And if it isn't, why are you doing it? You're going back to my, fill in the blank spreadsheet and coming up with the wrong decision. Yeah. And ultimately, we haven't really talked about it, but I view a problem statement as a way for people to get to making decisions, or for it to guide their decisions as they move along, right? If they have that as a kind of a backstop, they can more quickly move as an organization or as a team.
It's interesting. And this is a sort of a hint to Kent and Scott. The last question I asked is, what is your biggest takeaway or learning from this? And right now, starting with Kent, but reinforced by Pamela, the fact that the problem statement is actually a facilitative process to help people think through things versus just a written statement itself. Huge. And I've done it the same way, but I still, when I talk problem statement, I tend to talk who, what, why, format type stuff. not the facilitated process of asking the right questions, to help people whittle down from generic, we had a client that we were doing a new product strategy workshop, and the CEO founder said, you took us from amorphous to focused in 2 days, right? Because we asked those right questions. It was all around helping refine where it may be.
I want to add something else to what you're talking about, Grant, because when I was going through this process with this team, I was tag teaming with somebody else, right? And so it was really important for someone to be observing what we were doing and to come back and saying, this is where we're getting stuck. Okay, and then he would go in and do that next bit, and I would observe him, and I'd say, okay, now we got this far, but this is where we're getting stuck, and come in with the next idea. Yeah. So
I love it.
Yeah.
Steve, you've been a little quiet since your first rant. Overall thoughts. You're on mute. There's this cool thing called a mute me button.
Yeah, I wasn't looking at it. I'm reminded of Ron Jeffries' discussion of the 3 C's, and the card is the least relevant part. What's relevant is the conversation and the confirmation. Yeah. And I think we're all saying the same thing, is that, I think the dysfunctional point of view is, I wrote down this JIRA ticket, my work here is done, right? But this is an invitation to a conversation.
I mean, because I have to, one Drucker up, Scott, the value is in the planning, not the plan, right?
Or Eisenhower or Mike Tyson.
Yeah,
okay.
All of us.
I'm gonna twist you with a James Clear quote. Then you do not rise to the level of your goals; you fall to the level of your systems.
Very true.
Nice.
I'm gonna write that one down.
I think the whole discussion of taking this into a conversation reminds me of a story of where somebody who had an expensive car jokingly said, "I wish I had a low jack for my dad," and they started socializing this idea. His father had Alzheimer's, and all the bad things that go with that. And now there's like multiple products in the market for keeping track of, your parents when they're not where they're supposed to be. But I could see in the person I was discussing this with, he said, the developers and the marketers were like, we've got to start doing this right now. This is a problem that has to be fixed instantly. I mean, they were like, we'll work weekends. They were just so passionate about solving this problem because they really understood the aging parent, but also the child dealing with all of this. And I think a really good problem statement can create that passion to solve, real problems, and not, gee, could you move this button 3 pixels to the left?
Yeah. I'm going to just throw this out there. I'll start with May. Is a good problem statement sort of that a core tool in transitioning from outputs to outcomes?
No.
Okay.
And here's why. Because the outputs to outcome question is much bigger than that, right? Like you're entirely constrained by who gives you the ideas, right? If you're doing this at a leadership level, maybe, but as a PM by yourself, that's a hard thing to do, because half the time, if you're already at the point where you're using you're really pushing outputs because that's what you're told to do, like you're constrained by the system, right? I don't think this is a symptom, not.
I'll take that. I like that. What's the hardest thing about doing this?
Doing what?
Problem statements.
Depends how you define it, right? If we're defining it the way we're talking about it, where it's an invitation to have that conversation. In my experience working with teams, it's more people don't feel like they can talk, So really it comes back to that culture problem of how the teams are expected to work with each other. Less so when you're introducing change, but more so just in the day to day. If you're in a system where you're just expected to hand off this information and someone picks it up, it takes a lot of intentional communication and working together design in order to change how people work together. Because once you get into habit, you got to break those habits and then reform them and set expectations around how you actually uh, change. Like doing retros and doing nothing about it isn't enough.
Yeah.
But it's about just giving people the opportunity to figure out how they want to work together, and that's the culture change, right?
So the hardest thing is the change of culture, change of mindset to be able to do it.
Yeah.
I'll take that.
You fall to the level of your system, right?
With that reference to what Scott said, Scott, what's the hardest thing about making this work?
I think it's context dependent. If you're in an output oriented environment, like I think May's exactly right. It's how do you change the way everything's working, and using the problem, right? When people are just working against what Jeff Patton would call a flat list of stuff to do, the problem statement is problematic. It's not necessary, and it's annoying, right? It's a thorn in your foot. When you're in a system and a dialogue that allows for alignment to purpose, then I think the hardest thing about it is doing the synthesis that puts interesting ideas into it. It's like we all have access to the same information, sort of, right? We can all do the same external market research. We can all use. I just read a Harvard Business School article about using ChatGPT as a market research tool, because what it processes is the data of revealed preferences, not stated preferences. So it's actually in some ways better than what you would get from doing a survey, which is kind of terrifying to me. But like, I'm still processing it, because I'm definitely in the get off my lawn old man camp about this stuff. And that research was compelling and the opposite point of view. So we all have access to the same information. What we do with it in terms of having an epiphany, setting a direction, creating a focus, I think that's the hardest part if you're in a system where it can exist. And then I think a problem statement, when I'm doing transformation stuff, is a really nice fulcrum for driving the point of it opens eyes at the executive level that exposes that really what they're doing is they're trying to balance the risk of being late with the risk of being wrong, and using the problem statement as a way to establish that purpose and set direction and say, well, shit, we don't know. Okay, great. Do you need to know, or do you just need to get something out there? And being honest about that stuff. It's what makes it hard depends on where you're trying to do it.
I'm going to actually quote you to a client with that. I love the idea of the balance of being on time and being wrong, because so many people in a feature factory output type place, it's about being on time, just deliver it.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're delivering the wrong thing, you're wasting effort and cycles.
I also want to circle back to something Scott said. I mean, I'm kind of digging the whole Chat GPT thing, but the idea of using it for research just terrifies me. And I'm reminded when we moved to this neighborhood, we had this lovely little hardware store right around the corner, and I was there every weekend. And he's like, "Oh, Steve, what are you working on this week?" And he would tell me how to do it, and he'd sell me twice or three times what I really needed, but that was okay because I came back 3 hours later to get the things he told me to get that I didn't get. But anyway, within a year, we got a Lowe's, a Home Depot, a Builder Square, a True Value, and a fifth one. I forget which. And a year after that, all of them plus my neighborhood store went out of business because all of them were reading the same market research that says there's a big boom going on in Steve's neighborhood. And now I have no hardware store.
exact same thing was happening when I was working with a large automotive manufacturer, without naming names, right? The large ones were all reading the same tea leaves and all investing billions of dollars to run as fast as they can in exactly the same direction.
I mean, if there's ever a rationale for why you need to be doing your own market discovery and product, this is the type of stuff, is because we need to, if everybody else has access to it, nobody's got advantage from it. So Kent, I'm going to bring you back to that original question. Hardest thing. What's the hardest thing about it?
Remembering why you're doing it. So problem statements, user stories, other kind of documents, there's always a big emphasis placed on writing them. And I think the more people talk about writing user stories, the more people talk about writing problem statements, the more they're losing sight of why you're doing it in the first place. Because it's real easy to get in a group of people in the room and say, oh, today we're going to write a problem statement. Whenever I've done that exercise, the one thing I never remember coming out of it is what the actual problem statement was. What I do remember is the insights that people came up with during the discussions.
Yeah.
So it's really easy to write a problem statement, even with a group of people in the room. It's really hard to make sure the discussions actually dig into the points that need to get clarified when those discussions are going on.
Do you need a starting point for the discussion? Do you need a first draft, do you think?
When I've done it, I will usually have the person whose idea the whole initiative was, to actually give their spiel about what they think the problem is. And it usually ends up being they're describing their solution.
Yeah.
And then I preface it saying, here's kind of an intro. They'll usually do that. And then it's then the exercise of having everyone writing it out gives them a chance to interpret what they heard or what they understand and put it all out there to say, well, you might have this in your head about what it is. Here's what everyone else is thinking. It might be, haven't thought about it before. Here's what they heard. Or it's, they've been aware of it before. Here's what they think. Then it's completely different than what you just said.
Yeah. I love that.
Yeah, totally agree with Kent. But I don't think that's an issue. It's a target rich environment. Like what's Rich Marinoff, we never have a shortage of good ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Pamela, hardest thing.
No, I have to riff off that last one. Wasn't it like your job is basically to kill ideas? At some point, your job becomes yes and, right? Or no, or yes, not,
You have to say no, but use the phrase yes and so they don't kick you out of the room.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sorry, I kind of got distracted there. So I'm going to end there. You can go to somebody else. But
I have a
I'm going to
story.
punt. Every once in a while I punt. I'm punting.
All right, May, your story.
All right. So this wasn't exactly a problem statement, but I was having a really hard time getting people to talk to me. I was an IC also at the same time trying to push organizational change, which I learned to be occasionally futile depending on where you are. But I was having a really hard time getting senior leadership to even like look at the work that I was doing, even though it heavily impacts their team. So one thing I did was I intentionally wrote something that was extremely wrong. And I knew that was something I was never going to do, but I said, okay, so from what I understand, this is what we all want to do, right? Get back to me in a week, and if I don't hear back from you, I assume that's exactly what you want to do because you haven't told me I was wrong yet. And I got so much feedback.
So the intentional anomaly to get people to actually engage. I like that idea.
Because they do have their priorities, but until like it actually impacts them, they don't really realize it. So if you describe exactly how this bad idea that you're not actually going to do is going to hit their teams, like it is one way to get a slightly dysfunctional organization to actually have those conversations where otherwise you wouldn't be able to have any conversations at all. So
I love it.
To take a turn on May's, so it depends. Either you can do the conflicting, like this is something we're never going to do, or mine is usually I just put something out there and I say just some thoughts, and everybody dogpiles in like, okay, like this, don't like that, but I have no intention of that being final, right? But it allows people to react against things, which I think is important, because part of, I think, the goal of the problem statement that we're kind of going around is to get people to agree on something with some kind of rational understanding of the situation, right?
I'm looking at, hell, I think everybody here has facilitated these things. If you know that they're wrong in what they're getting alignment on, do you step in?
I do. And I probably shouldn't, because so often the stated reason I'm there is to help them change how they're doing things. The reason, the actual reason, the reason I'm there and not any of the, handful of people who could help them change, is because I have opinions, and I'll interrogate the ideas while I'm helping them learn how to interrogate the ideas.
Yeah, I believe. Kent, you were going to say something?
I'll step in. If I'm on good behavior, I'll step in with questions.
And use the questions to guide them.
Yes. If I'm feeling salty, I'll just say, "Why are you doing that?" Which I guess is in the form of a question.
Yeah.
It's just the tone of voice you use.
Exactly.
Because you work with a company, even if I'm not doing the discovery myself, you start getting enough domain knowledge that you understand stuff. And, it's tough. And sometimes it's like, to your point, Scott, you're trying to teach them how to do it, but you can't let them fall into a trap, right?
Yeah.
You got to model it.
Yeah.
Actually, the approach that May described is excellent for that kind of thing. It's just basically just carry out what they're talking about to its furthest extent and help them see,
why it's wrong.
Wait, yeah. Boy, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I call it a coherence check when I'm setting expectation with leadership. Like, we're going to do this. You're going to tell us what to build, and we're going to model out the expected outcomes, and we're going to have a coherence check with you. It's just, right, it's a fancy term for active listening that makes them feel important.
Yeah, no, I love it. It took me back to an experience when I was in college where we did this outward bound type like hike where the team had to find 3 different checkpoints together. And our team got to the first one first and got their heads full, and then started making really bad decisions. And I knew exactly every bad decision they made. And I didn't say anything until they were about to have us cross a river. And I'm like, I am not crossing a river. That's when I jumped in. But when I do this with clients, I love the Kent's view of how do you almost take them to the end state to help them see it themselves. Before we get to the takeaway question, one last thing. Where do you start? If somebody's trying to get better, where should they start? And I'm just going to go through everybody, and I'll start with Pamela. Where should you start?
For me, it is basically making it a precondition of working with them that we actually sit down and work on this. I think there isn't any other way of doing it. You have to start with, we will be doing this.
Yeah.
I don't think you can let people off on, we're just going to spend like half an hour doing this and then we'll move on. It's just not, you are the
non-negotiable.
You're the stick in the mud, right? Yeah. You do not let them move forward because they haven't been through it and they don't see the value. And I'm speaking, I'm assuming an audience, right?
Yeah.
But most people are so much in the groove of how they do things, you have to pull them out.
I love it. Kent, where to start?
I start by not positioning it as something you got to check the box on, it's done. Rather, we're having a series of discussions. One of the discussions, the topic is going to be this.
Yeah. Love it. Scott, where should they start?
I'm contractually obligated as a consultant to say it depends. So, right, the useless answer, but accurate, right, the flying over on the balloon is meet them where they're at.
Yeah.
And if they're in a headspace around outputs and processing dictation and just, we declare success when we're finished building. I'll run through an exercise. So we'll do the coherence check and say, well, let's work backwards. What do we expect to happen after we do that? What are the consequences going to be? What are the effects going to be? And I'll verbally walk them through an impact map all the way back up to an outcome. And then all of a sudden it's an interesting conversation to say, is that the outcome that justifies the spend to build the thing? And if they're ready to go in that conversation, I'll go in that conversation, and we can use the problem statement as a way to frame that up and articulate it and bring in the different layers of uncertainty and estimation ranges and risk and wherever it's going to go, but start with wherever they are.
Yeah. Love it. May, where do you start?
I usually start with who do I need to talk to first, right? So the way I think about problem statements is like it's a tool that you use to invite a conversation. Who do I need to have that conversation with? And kind of going back to what Kent said, like what are their buttons? Or sorry, meet them where they're at. And so you can figure you kind of write your problem statements for that initial audience where you can then refine it. If by the time you get it to the larger audience, your problem statement is going to look nothing like where you started, unless if you've magically came across the thing that actually works, right? But if the goal is to get as much context as possible to collectively make a better decision, then like just start somewhere. Like use it as an invitation. Figure out who you're talking to. Who are you marketing to build that strategy?
Yeah.
Not just the audience in terms of your solution, but the audience in terms of your problem statement discussion.
Yeah. Steve.
Well, as with many things, I usually start with a story.
As with both things or with everything?
With all things, yeah.
Who are you and what have you done with Steve Johnson?
It's like, let me tell you the story about the guy who wants a LoJack for his dad, and I had a case many years ago where the product managers were saying development sucks and they want us to give them specs. And I went to development and they said, oh, product management sucks because they don't know what they want. And I start looking at some of the communications they've had, and product management are writing requirements like the product needs to be better. And then the developers were saying, how many pixels wide is that? And so I brought them together into the same room and said, we're not leaving this room until both development, product management, and I agree that we are communicating.
I love it. And I guess that comes down to that. It's all about communication, right? It's a tool for communication and getting people aligned. For me, the place I've always started is normally it starts with I'm working with a product leader or a product manager, and it's describe the problem to me, right? If they haven't written it, I want them to describe it. And then it starts with that interrogation, as Ken talked about, how do you ask the right questions to start walking through it? For them to start understanding that sometimes they think they have it done. They think they're good. And I think it's about helping them understand what they don't understand and how do we go there. So final question we always ask, what's your biggest learning or takeaway from this conversation? And I'm going to start with Pamela. Biggest learning or takeaway?
Yeah, I guess we've kind of gotten to this, and I think it is that as someone who facilitates these conversations, part of the value I bring is the ability to not quite act dumb, but really ask people to explain things to me as an outsider. May's laughing here because it forces everybody in the room to kind of see me as the outsider, and they're going to explain it. And as a result, it surfaces issues that they haven't surfaced between each other in a way that isn't as politically damaging as doing it with each other.
Yeah.
So the outsider role has a really strong role to play in getting to good problem statements.
I like that. Well, of course, for us who are all consultants and that type of stuff, it also sets us up well. Kent, biggest learning or takeaway?
In the future, when I have discussions about problem statements, I need to find someone else to actually drive the conversation so I can sit back and listen.
I love that thing from Pamela talking about having the two people. That was a nice takeaway for me as well. I love that. Scott.
I think for me, it's an increased emphasis on the distillation of insight that's already in the room with the people in the room as you facilitate them through that. And you bring together the takeaways, the epiphanies, the shared understanding stuff.
I put it in a post yesterday. In my experience, I found 80% of the insight you need is already in the heads of the people in the company, in the four walls, but they don't know how to get to it, extract it, distill it, as you said, into where it needs to go. And that's, again, back to Pamela's point, right? Having a good outside person to help ask the questions and help facilitate that conversation is so important. Thank you, Scott. May, learning a takeaway.
Doubling down on the whole, this is an invitation to talk and understand the bigger context. I think everyone added a whole lot of color to what that looks like and what the impact of that that process and that flow. So I have a better understanding of what this looks like now.
If I could go back and rename the week, it would be getting to problem statements versus problem statements, because problem statements is, I don't know.
It's a tool.
It's a tool. I've already given away my takeaway. Steve, your takeaway.
I've always felt that the teams that I work with need context, and these conversations provide them that context. Otherwise, you find yourself saying, no, not that way, this way. You find yourself micromanaging, and who has time for that? So the more you can provide context, the less detail you have to provide, and the more that context drives passion, the more enthusiasm the people working on whatever it may be, the more enthusiastic they are about it.
No, I love it. And again, my takeaway, it was takeaway at the beginning, the idea of this is a process, it's a getting to it, it's the conversations, not the statement itself. And I'm going to throw in there a nice little tool or cudgel, May's idea of intentionally giving them something that's, not an outcome people would know, just to get them engaging. I think it could be a really interesting tool to shake things up, to get people thinking outside the box when it comes to that. So what a wonderful conversation. Kent, thank you for joining us. Scott, I'm so glad we're able to take our lunch conversations into product conversations. And as always, I feel like, it could keep going. Pamela, May, my friend Steve, what a wonderful conversation. I've learned so much. In 2 weeks, in summer, we're doing this on 2-week cycles. In 2 weeks, we're going to do PRDs. May is going to be leading this for us. But a conversation on PRDs. I'm going to be actually on PTO, but May will take the lead on this one. And that'll be in 2 weeks. So thank you, everybody, and especially everybody in the comments for keeping the conversation going there as well. Have a great weekend, everybody. We'll see you next week. Or actually, I'll see you guys whenever. But product conversation will be back in 2 weeks. Take care, everybody.
Bye.